Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Brian Cooper. This is the second part of our interview with David Austin Walsh about his book, Taking America Back, The Conservative Movement and the Far Right. In our previous episode, which I do recommend you go listen to, we discussed his controversial tweets and the reaction from many right-wing elites and influencers to attempt to recruit him into the conservative, anti-woke, anti-so-called cancel culture movement. But in this episode, we talk a little bit more about the substance of the book and what the Trump candidacy represents, the fascism debate, as we've discussed on the podcast before, and some other questions. But let me stop wasting your time, and we can get to the second half of the interview right now. I want to shift gears a little bit, David. You've been talking about, sort of referencing, alluding to the characters in your book, William F. Buckley, Merwin K. Hart, and the fact that these guys tried to recruit you with a sort of, unsubtly dangling money job status. It's funny that immediately that it's actually the exact opposite of, I don't want quit groveling, you lib pussy type of thing. But what they're actually asking for is to grovel before them. And you will get lots of money if you just forget all your previous commitments and, betray people. The other piece of that we haven't touched on, aside from trying to basically bait, credible lefty or leftist intellectuals into the movement, is that there's a massive pipeline for people who are just coming up, who are just starting. Money, jobs, status, prestige, whatever. There's just this. If you ever are involved in sort of DC politics or the sort of magazine journalism world, it's just beyond obvious that there is this enormous complex of institutions ready and willing to hire anybody who can basically just write okay, and a lot of people who really can't, because the demand for credible voices is so high that the market is just, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. There just aren't that many. But my question for you about the book is, what does this show about the role of intellectuals in a political movement? The fact that they're trying to get you suggests that they think it's important to have. But how do you see the role of, intellectuals, and, possibly also just sort of organizers, networkers, connectors in, the conservative political context?
Yeah, I mean, and this is actually one of the things that sort of got me involved in this project many years ago in the first place, because I was trying to make sense of, the American right at the time. And this is back during the late Bush administration, beginning of the Obama administration, was and remains profoundly anti-intellectual. They're, all of the stereotypes, and this is, and they weren't as racialized as they are now with the anti-DEI stuff, but, the stereotypes back in the 2000s were, egg-headed liberal professors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, that's been a dynamic going back at least a century. I mean, at least since the 1930s. You have, Merwin Hart's, one of his sort of first sort of political crusades in the late not his first. This is happening at the same time as he's being incredibly pro-Franco. Just thinking Francisco Franco is the greatest guy ever, and he travels to Spain and is writing pro-Franco propaganda in New York newspapers. But he's also involved in a campaign against textbooks written by acolytes of John Dewey. This guy Rugg, if I remember correctly, was one of his sort of targets. And the idea was that you have these sort of, liberal, leftist, socialist or even communist professors who are, indoctrinating American kids into, hating capitalism and hating the free market, et cetera. So, and then that was sort of extended to, the sort of broader, they're the eggheads, these snobby, pompous intellectuals. And then you have, the hardworking sort of American, there's a real producerist element to this. What's interesting is that there's also the fetishization of a particular kind of intellectual affect. And I think Buckley, in particular, is a perfect case in point here, because William F. Buckley was not a particularly distinguished intellectual. He, produced no great scholarly works or really anything of I think particularly analytical insight. I mean, we're talking about a guy who wrote a novel where he, a self-insert of himself fucks the Queen of England, Saving the Queen from 1973. This is Blackford Oaks.
A little on the nose, I think, David. It was a little on the nose.
Yeah. So, but he had the affect of an intellectual. He had, the Northeastern Mid-Atlantic accent. He presented himself a particular way, both in print and especially on firing line, and had obviously had tremendous personal charisma. And so, there was a sort of commitment to a particular kind of like classical intellect, English boarding school intellectual affect. And so even, more populist and more explicitly anti-intellectual organizations like the John Birch Society were very, very proud of, the affiliation of somebody like Revillo Oliver, who was a classics professor at the University of Illinois. He was one of the founding members of the John Birch Society in 1958. He's the only guy. There were like 11 men present when Robert Welch created the group in Indianapolis. He was the only person there who wasn't either ex-military or a businessman. But he was tremendously important to the organization because they felt that he gave them some kind of intellectual or, scholarly heft and credibility. It meant that they were not just kooks or crazies, but actually had real substantive intellectual commitments. Now, of course, Oliver was a scholar of Sanskrit. He had, his work was really unconnected to his politics, which was one of the many fascinating things about him. But I do think that there is a desire. One of the things that, I believe it's a Freudian term. It's been, I'd certainly been, bouncing around in my head ever since the thread went viral, but, wounded attachment. I clearly have a wounded attachment to the academy. Most people working in the academy have a wounded attachment to it because it's an institution that, you want the approval of and want to do well in, and, it doesn't treat you well or, whatever. And I think that basic dynamic does also describe how conservative intellectual and cultural elites sort of relate to the status of the intellectual. They want to be taken seriously as thinkers, as intellectuals. It's why you have all of this investment by right-wing philanthropy in setting up, programs like the James Madison program at Princeton. It's what the Allen Foundation used to call the beachhead strategy. It's why you have explicitly conservative colleges like Hillsdale or, Hillsdale in particular, because they've essentially rebranded as not, they used to be like an evangelical Christian college, I believe. Now they've rebranded as we're, invested in a classical education. And they do a lot of, stuff on, online courses about, like teaching Shakespeare and whatnot. So there is a desire, but I mean, you read presumably that piece in the Baffler, by, somebody who went undercover at the University of Austin.
Oh, I saw it, but I clicked, but I have not read yet.
I mean, just as an ethnography, it's so fascinating. So this guy goes to the University of Austin's, seminar on combating wokeness in the humanities. Every single person there, every single student there is like, a 22-year-old STEM, computer science guy who, wants to read Shakespeare, but not have to deal with like feminist interpretations of it, not have to deal with the ongoing scholarly conversations. They just want to celebrate it. I mean, I wrote something in Boston Review a couple of years ago, which I think really, I'm sorry, I'm taking a long way to, instead of a long-winded answer to your question. But I wrote a piece in Boston Review a couple of years ago, right after the 1619 Project, was published and all of the sort of right-wing pylons on that. And my view at the time, and I think this has been borne out since, is what was fundamentally at stake there, was what, and there were plenty of criticisms legitimate criticisms that you could point to the 1619 Project, although I think on whole it was actually a very, very good and well done thing. But for many leading conservatives, the issue was that history is not something that is the subject of inquiry or analysis or, scholarly conversation or debate. It's a source of authority. And that's how I think they view intellectualism writ large. Being an intellectual is not a ongoing process. It's not a dialogue. It's basically a celebration of great works, educating students into how great this stuff is. And that's basically it. It's a source of authority as opposed to, inquiry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you're talking about like actual academia, but I also mean, intellectual in the like the Gramscian sense, just like anybody involved in the sort of like process of producing intellectual.
Like there's a reason that Jordan Peterson is elevated by the Rufo types, right? Because like the reason they picked a guy who was a disaffected academic to be a reactionary voice.
But so it seems also, you have two additional tasks here that are very important for a sort of intellectual. Number one is propaganda, just like producing like good sounding, convincing, arguments for the movement. And then also you have sort of behind the scenes and also in the pages of these little magazines and newspapers and whatnot, you're trying to knit these factions together. Yeah. And prevent the movement from just splintering into a million pieces. And it seems like that's like a pretty core part of the story that you're trying to tell here, is like how like guys like Buckley, he was kind of stupid at the end of the day, but like in terms of being an organizer, a movement builder, and a networker, that's kind of intellectual labor of a sort. And it was key to, developing and cohering and consolidating the, conservative movement, right?
No, I think that's true. And I think that one of the things this was the case in the 1950s. It very much is the case today. But in moments of flux, when you don't have it's a little bit different now because that moment of flux is over. But in moments of flux where you have different factions on the right who are sort of competing for hegemonic influence, that's when you see like magazine wars. That's the title chapter. That's the title of one of my chapters in the book. And that was about the conflicts between the American Mercury and National Review in the 50s. But the same is true of, half a dozen different publications today. I mean, Compact Magazine alone and, American Affairs, the sort of more traditional, the Bulwark, which is, sort of more out of the neocon tradition. You have all of these different publications, and it's also easier now in the 21st century to just have, because you don't need a printing press, you don't need access to a distribution network, you can just put it online. So it's easier to have a sort of multitude of different publications, even as in, our attention economy, only one can really become hegemonic. It is, Ron, you're absolutely right. It is intellectual labor. And it can get especially, sort of bitter and contested, in these moments of flux. In the sort of Gramscian sense, absolutely.
Is there something going on today that's different from the paleo conservative versus neoconservative kind of internecine battle on the right that we had with Pat Buchanan and the Bushes and everything? Because there's been some write-ups even early on in the Trump ascendancy that he was kind of just a paleocon in the tradition of Pat Buchanan. Mm-hmm. And then, this recruitment by Rufo of you and the turn from the Taibbis of the world to the right. Is there something different about this, like what some people call a red-brown alliance, or the poaching of former leftists or leftists who turn to the right, that's different from this kind of more traditional split between the paleo and the neocons, where the quote-unquote respectable right and the crackpots? Like, how would you characterize the evolution today, do you think?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think that, so William Luther Pierce, who was, sort of Reveal Oliver's mentee in the 1970s, he was the successor of effectively the successor of George Lincoln Rockwell as the sort of head of the American neo-Nazi movement after Rockwell was assassinated in 1967. He's also very infamously the author of the Turner Diaries. So, the white supremacist novel about the overthrowing the U.S. government that inspired Timothy McVeigh and others. In his magazine in the early 1970s, which was called Attack with an exclamation point at the end, he would write openly about how, one of the goals of the white supremacist movement, of the American neo-Nazi movement, was to co-opt, I think the term he used was to heighten racial consciousness, among, Marxists on college campuses. And it's because, according to Pierce, these were the people who were the most sort of politically dynamic and effective actors and had the sort of youthful energy and vitality, and also were willing to commit violence that he wanted to have as part of his movement. So I do think that that's kind of sort of the dynamic here in the 2020s, that because for the reason we were discussing around people like Taibbi, because, there are people on the left who, have been more or less expelled from respectable left-wing circles, because of their, repeated commitment to, racism or transphobia or, just good old-fashioned misogyny. They are seen as, really potentially effective political allies by, the far right. You also have, the other factor here, which is that the sort of basis of the red-brown alliance, as it were, is a sort of shared disaffection with American liberalism. This is the underlying sort of factor behind Compact magazine. I mean, it's like I read Compact. Most of it is borderline fascist, but every now and then you'll see something there which is like, oh, this could have been published in Jacobin, because it does actually have like a decent class analysis. So, and particularly since Biden was elected, right? Because there really wasn't this same specific combination during the first Trump administration, because at least in the left, there was, I think, more of a commitment to, some kind of, really until 2020, some kind of like broad popular front approach to opposing Trump and sort of incipient American fascism. As soon as Trump's gone, as soon as he's out of office, then you're left again with the problem of American liberalism. And, for people like, what's his name? The guy who, podcaster guy, sort of an older guy. I think he's based on the West Coast. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Jimmy, what's his name?
Yeah. Jimmy Dore. For a guy like that, the enemy is still American liberalism, and not wrongly. I mean, obviously there's tremendous issues with American liberalism, and we've seen, particularly, but where do you look for allies, when that is the sort of hegemonic, particularly, before, the sort of more recent crisis in 2024, when it did actually seem as if, the Biden pledge to return to normalcy, which he never made explicitly, but has been very much the animating feature of his presidency, did actually appear to be successful, or could appear to be successful. Yeah. You sort of look for allies where you can find them. So I think that was an important dynamic. Less important, it does have to be said, than the phenomenon of reactionary centrism, which, is also effectively a kind of like, not red, but, is a similar, story, of people from different political camps combining in defense of their own sort of privileged position.
This maybe is a good window into analysis of Trump. A big kind of core argument of your book is that, is sort of trying to break through the, opposing arguments that you hear from folks like Rick Perlstein, that Donald Trump was a total break with conservatism. We didn't understand it, versus like the continuity thesis, that Trump's no different. In fact, maybe better than George W. Bush. Who knows? That it's all basically same fruit of the same poison tree. And you sort of synthesize these right towards the beginning of your book. You say, quote, the essential political story of MAGAism in 2016 was the displacement of a dominant conservative coalition that had broadly tolerated, and in some cases even cultivated, far-right support, with a dominant far-right coalition that tolerated and in some cases even cultivated conservative support. It's about the story of a factional struggle. And, I think you sort of shed a lot of light on the fascism debate in this way. The question of whether Trump is a fascist, by sort of saying like, well, there was always elements of that in there, but they were never on top until now.
Yeah. And I think that's actually, that's the key difference between the paleocon, neocon, conflict. But yeah, no, the thing is that the paleocons more or less lost in the 1980s and 1990s, and they won in the 2010s. And there are broad reasons for that. Some of that involves political organizing. Most of it involves Donald Trump, as a sort of sui generis thing. It also, I mean, it also really much underlines just how important the kind of leader principle is certainly in conservative politics in the United States, because as soon as Trump wins, like, all of these, quote unquote, respectable conservatives, including National Review, which runs obviously the Never Trump issue in 2016, just rejoin the fold. And now the guy is, again, a convicted felon, and we're seeing a similar dynamic play out now. So, yeah, I do think that the key distinction is that you have far right hegemony in the 21st century in ways that were never really the case in the 20th. But I do think there's been a lot of debate in academic circles about this very thing. Is Trump a disruption? Is he a break? Is it in continuity? I think what I try to gesture towards in the book, and where I think the sort of consensus in the scholarship is going, is that it's really an accelerant. Donald Trump is an accelerant. He's not. There is something different that happens in the 21st century, in the 2010s, that is not totally in keeping with the sort of patterns of the conservative political tradition in America. But you can see it in the conservative political tradition. It's just never been emphasized, or it hasn't been emphasized to a sufficient degree. And then you have that accelerating in 2015, 2016, to the point now where you have, it's something like, I was just talking about this with a friend the other day. Trumpism, MAGAism is not there's not a majority in the United States for it. But we're talking about maybe 30 to 35% of the public that is like fully on board with this stuff, which is a lot. That's probably one of the largest factions in American politics today.
Yeah.
Millions of people. Yeah.
Hitler never got more than 37% in free and fair elections, even fair-ish. I mean, they tried to cheat as much as they could, but that was enough. That was enough. So I don't know. I suppose we should talk a little bit about the fascism debate. And I think, we've been on and on around this circle, 50 times. I've been calling Trump a fascist since 2015, or at least a quasi-fascist. I think he's changed a lot since then. And I think people are fooling themselves. They think a second Trump term is going to be just like the first one. But I think what's interesting about your analysis, David, is that, I think you could legitimately come down fairly on either side, as you think about it, is, go down the list of characteristics or whatever. But I think what annoys me about the fascism debate is that it's really a proxy for are the liberals the real enemy or not?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. You want to speak to that a little bit?
No, I think that's exactly it. But yeah, I do think that the fascism debate has been a proxy for debates about American liberalism. Absolutely. My position, and I think it's been fairly consistent over time, has been that there is a domestic fascist tradition in America.
Yes.
And it's not just like the German-American Bund. You can see it in any number of different spaces. It was never in a position until quite recently to contest national political power, but it's always been there. And it's never been as on the margins as the discourse around fascism, certainly since 2016, but even before in like the 80s and 90s, would suggest. I mean, I don't know if you remember like History Channel documentaries from the 90s and early aughts about like the Klan and, the American Nazi Party, at the time, like these lunatics who were in these compounds in the Pacific Northwest. There was a sense that, I mean, you even get this in some of the scholarly literature, like Kathleen Belew's wonderful book, Bring the War Home, from a few years ago, that, yes, there are domestic fascists. There is this sort of violent American neo-Nazi movement, but they are ultimately still fringe. And my point, certainly in the book, and I've said this in public facing stuff over the years, is that, well, no, this is much more central in American politics, much closer to the mainstream than this discourse would have otherwise suggested. And so, yeah, I mean, part of my frustration with the fascism debate is that, one, it is about American liberalism, but it's also about understanding sort of fascism as a condition to be diagnosed, as opposed to just looking at, well, who are people who call themselves fascists and who are they aligning with? And, what is their power and influence in culture and politics? Because if we're debating, again, the Dylan Riley thesis about you need a powerful left and trade unions to, spark a fascist backlash or, et cetera, et cetera. That to me is sort of missing the point. It's sort of getting bogged down in Marxist theories of how fascism emerges, which, are valuable, but don't tell you the whole story. So, one of the other things I've been kind of frustrated by the fascism debate over the years is that with very few exceptions, it really has not involved people who study American politics and specifically the American right. It's a lot of people who are very heavily invested in like Frankfurt School theory literature. And for understandable reasons, because, the question of what fascism is fundamentally a theoretical question in politics. But it did not involve people who actually look seriously at American political history. And when you do that, certain patterns emerge, which do suggest that this is not a foreign, tradition or whatever. I mean, really one of the things that I've always thought, and again, I try to do this in the book, is to, bring that question a little bit more into the foreground to kind of push back against a particular kind of American exceptionalism, this idea that any kind of fascist tradition, is sort of necessarily revolving around, in the United States is revolving around a kind of like proxy relationship with European political and intellectual theory, which I don't think is really the case. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, Robert Paxton says that the KKK was, arguably the first like sort of proto-fascist, group. And, you don't have in that circumstance, like, rising socialist movement necessarily. But what you do have is the mass enfranchisement of, newly freed slaves right after the Civil War. And,
you read about it. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the Klan. I think Paxton uses the Klan as a sort of proxy for all sorts of different groups in the Reconstruction South. But I mean, the red shirts in South Carolina in 1876. I mean, you read that and it's like, shit, this is exactly how Mussolini seized power in 1922. It's it's the exact same techniques, right down to the paramilitarism coming from from Great War veterans. So yeah, absolutely. I think Paxton's right.
Yeah. And in 2008,
and this
first black president.
This is where I was going to say that this is where the rubber meets the road too, because theory and praxis, have to go together. It's not just a semantic debate on how we draw the line with concepts, because the question is, and this is really relevant for how the Samuel Moyens and the Corey Robbins and the Daniel Bessners of the world are arguing, like, what is the actual power analysis of the danger, where the danger lies? How dangerous is it? What is the nature of the threat? What should we do? What's required to combat the threat? And I think it's really important to identify the threat that MAGA is and the far right's ascendancy in a way that doesn't, there's a reason that January 6th happened with this president, not under George W. Bush, right? And not that there aren't terrible horrors that happened under the quote unquote respectable conservatives. That's not the point, right? But we need to understand the nature of the threat.
Alexia, building on that, because the sort of classic response, which is not wrong, is that, well, you didn't have January 6th under George W. Bush, but you did have the Brooks Brothers riot. And at the end of the day, is there a tremendous distinction between the two? Now, I would say yes, but conditionally so, because you have essentially the same dynamic happening. Let's try to throw out the results of an election. One of which was successful. That was the Brooks Brothers riot, in no small part because it rejected, the more or less explicit paramilitarism of January 6th in favor of a sort of quasi-legal, but very shady and with the threat of violence, but it did not actually spill into direct violence. So, one of the things that I don't want to lose sight of here is, and I don't want to let sort of American liberalism off the hook here, because before the most recent thread, the sort of my last brush with Twitter notoriety was when I said in the immediate aftermath of the clearing of the Columbia encampment by the NYPD, like, I don't know if I can vote for Joe Biden after seeing something like this. And the logic there was that, if this is what an anti-fascist politics, a liberal anti-fascist politics ultimately leads to, which is deploying the NYPD, who are, as I think it was that guy from the 5-4 podcast said, Peter Shimshuri said recently that, they are both individually as cops on the right and then institutionally on the right. That's a function of the police. If liberal anti-fascist politics lead you to the point where, a quote unquote liberal institution like Columbia University can bring in the goon squad to crush campus protests, well, then what exactly is the point? And so I am sympathetic to that. I do think that it is a difference in degrees. I mean, even the Frankfurt School people, I can't remember which one it was Adorno or Horkheimer or whomever, did say at one point that, the functions, the same functions at a sort of very basic level of how fascism operates are also to be found under liberalism.
Absolutely.
So it is absolutely a difference of degrees, but I do think the difference of degrees is actually important, especially when we're sort of coming at it from a harm reduction perspective.
Well, that's the thing. They say that, I like it when I see the Confederate flag on the truck, because then I know what I'm dealing with instead of the dog whistle thing. Except we know that when Trump gave rallies, that the incidence of hate crimes went up an enormous amount in those places from the immediate preceding years. So there is actually more violence that happens when it's green light, explicitly do whatever you want.
Well, and the other factor, and I just wrote an op-ed about this in the New York Times last week before, again, I self-imploded. But, it was in response to that Unified Reich video that just went out. That was only 2 weeks ago now. And my perception of that was, and I take the Trump campaign sort of statement afterwards that, it wasn't something that, Trump had personally signed off on or anything. It was some Trump supporting meme factory guy and it got retweeted. But that in and of itself tells you all you need to know. I mean, you have guys who are, openly pro-Nazi, who are in positions of influence and authority, at least on the sort of staff side, on the sort of, Ryan, to your point about the sort of importance of the intellectuals, the kind of intellectual labor that's happening is happening among those cadres. And these are the people who are going to be tabbed. This is why it's so dangerous. These are the people who are going to go into the second Trump administration, if he wins. Project 2025, the sort of bold vision to purge the civil service and completely transform the federal government and replace them with Trump loyalists, right? Who are going to fill those positions? It's going to be people who have been mainlining Jordan Peterson and, James Lindsay and, Chris Rufo. Chris Rufo will probably be a Trump appointee, in 2025 if Trump wins. I mean, hold my feet to the fire if that prediction doesn't come true, but I strongly suspect he will have a position in the federal government. And that's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, Nick Fuentes. Remember Trump met with Nick Fuentes
and Kanye.
Yeah.
So
I think it was Alex Breen who made this prediction after the Charlottesville riot. That here's the future of the Republican Party right here. These are the only people who are attracted to Republican politics nowadays. It's this type of guy. And sure enough, that's, fast forward 7 years and, the pipeline of people who were in high school or whatever at that time, now they're, reaching their age of, setting up the deportation camps. So Trump can supposedly, if he gets his way, get rid of 15 million people.
Well, and it's not super, promising that Biden is the better choice because his genocide would be less bad and that he still wants to work with Trump on immigration, I guess before the conviction at least. But I wouldn't be surprised if he still wanted to work with Trump on immigration. So it's we're not in a great place, folks.
I think regardless of who wins in November, I mean, there is a real wind at the sail of the forces of reaction. One of the things that I agree with the sort of anti-fascist crowd on is the overuse of the Weimar analogy, because I think that that's not actually been all that. There's always a problem with analogies. It's fair. But the way that that's deployed as this means that, Trump is Hitler. And, the arc of American history is going to map on exactly to the arc of German history in the 1920s and early 30s is a mistake. But what I do think is true is that where I do think the analogy is appropriate is that, the Weimar Republic was incredibly fragile. And by 1930, certainly no later than 1931, they were kind of screwed no matter what happened because of the massive systemic problems, both in terms of, German political economy, but also their specific governance structures, that were never resolved. And one of the things that has been sort of making the rounds, Ryan, you were just gesturing towards this, that Hitler never got a majority, which is absolutely true. The Nazi Party never got a majority. And he actually ran for president against Hindenburg in 1932. And lost fairly decisively. Hindenburg got over 50% of the vote. The problem is that Hindenburg's voters, so he was elected president first in 1925. Most of his voters shifted to Hitler by 1932. The people who voted for Hindenburg in 32 were liberals and socialists who voted Hindenburg as a way to block Hitler from coming into power. And then lo and behold, 6 months later, he fucking comes into power anyway because Hindenburg gives it to him on a platter because he does not want to have to deal with liberals and socialists as his part of his coalition. So, and again, I'm not saying that that's mapping on, but we're just at a moment of immense flux and stress in American politics, both, in terms of the campaign and just structurally, that it's hard to see. It's hard to see a way out. Certainly the way out has to come through sort of massive internal reform, but the obstacles to that seem to be insurmountable. Certainly have been over the past 8 years. When Trump winning in the first place should have been a wake up call.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can point to a lot of I've always felt that Mussolini is a much more apt analogy to Trump than Hitler. In that, he came to power and it took him several years. There were several years of normal parliamentary government before he managed to consolidate his regime. It was not ever as, just iron fisted and run with, just ruthless, total dictatorial power at the top. I don't think Trump is capable of that. Certainly not now, but you set yourself up as dictator. It doesn't it's not really great, regardless of how, sort of competent the guy is at running the bureaucracy.
Yeah. And what's also distinct now in 2024. I mean, I remember in 2020, during the George Floyd uprisings, and, I was out in the streets in DC, and, there was a time, in fact, I distinctly remember going out the night of, I forget the precise day, but when Trump cleared out Lafayette Square and, had tear gassed everybody to have his little photo op at the church there. And, there were people going out and breaking curfew to counter protest that, afterwards. And I remember thinking that night, well, shit. I mean, the airborne could come in and just shoot everybody. That is definitely something that appears, and there were rumors flying that something like that's going to happen. That was even before they started buzzing us with the helicopters and kettling people downtown. Now, fortunately, that didn't happen. And I remember waking up the next day thinking, well, at the minimum, what this means is that the military is not on Trump's side in a kind of like martial law coup situation. And I think we saw that play out on January 6th as well. I don't know that that's still the case. I hope it is. I suspect it is. But what is the case is that the legal system is on his side, barring the conviction in New York State court. The Supreme Court is we've seen this repeatedly with both Clarence Thomas and now Sam Alito. They have more or less pledged public fealty to Trump. And you've got a conservative majority on the court. So, in legal terms, the legal system, at least at the federal level, is on the guy's side. And that's significant and frightening, both in the election. And then if he does win, what that then allows for going forward. Yeah.
Great. Well, David Walsh, the book is Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement in the Far Right. I thought it was great. Great book. Good work. Yeah. Don't let it go to your head.
Yeah, that's no danger of that anymore, thank God.
Yeah, well, also keep your head up. You're a valuable voice. We appreciate you.
Yeah. And thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.